how to interpret the significance and behind-the-scenes meanings of President Obama's decision to go to Hiroshima, official visit, in fact, this time is an interesting question, isn't it? Mr. Jimbo, your interpretation here, is it an apology or not?
Well, President Obama's main agenda is to realize the world free of nuclear weapons, and he made a historic speech in Prague back in 2009. And he actually paid an effort to decrease the strategic nuclear weapons with Russia. He made a deal with Iran for delaying the process of the nuclearization at least for 10 to 20 years. And then I think his main agenda is to finalize its own goal to, aspire for the nuclear weapons by visiting very symbolical historic city of Hiroshima. So I think it is based on his main agenda to realize his own agendas.
But the question is, Mr. Jimbo, how is it likely to be interpreted in Japan at the time when the war was at a critical stage? Of course, Japan eventually lost, as they say, starting from the Hiroshima crisis, of course. So how is it likely to be interpreted to the Japanese?
Obviously, for Japanese people and the government, Hiroshima has special meaning. Obviously, we suffered, the mass humanitarian casualty because of the dropping of the atomic bomb. It has been symbolized as the peace studies in Japan and our symbolical gesture for the non-nuclear world. But at the same time, the Japanese government or the media did not demand the official apology of President Obama, but rather we welcome his visit because of his demonstration of the compassionate towards this historical site in Hiroshima.
All right. Professor Kuznick, should the U.S. apologize at all? Of course, the White House said not at all, and we are not apologizing also for the crisis, or rather the sacrifices made by the American soldiers during World War II to liberate different parts of the world, including to fight against the Japanese aggression during the Second World War. What do you make of the behind-the-scenes reasons, Professor?
Well, I think it would be a good idea. I think the United States should apologize for the atomic bombs. The atomic bombs were neither militarily necessary and certainly not morally justifiable. The Japanese were already pressing for peace at that point. Truman understood that better than almost anybody. He says that when he got Stalin's acknowledgement that the Russians were going to come into the Pacific War at Potsdam, Truman writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife the next day, the Russians are coming in, we'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the boys who won't be killed. He describes the intercepted July 18th telegram as a telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Truman knew full well that the Soviet invasion was going to end the war, that the Japanese would know that it was all hope was
so
lost.
your
at
point
that
is, Professor?
My point is that the atomic bombings were a horrific lesson to the world of what the United States was willing to do to send a message about American post-war hegemony. That's a shameful incident, and that Obama should certainly apologize for what happened. But that's not the most important thing. I agree with the idea that actions speak louder than words, and what Obama really needs to do is use this as an occasion to push an anti-nuclear agenda, to follow through on his pledge in Prague to call for nuclear abolition. Unfortunately, Obama has gone the opposite direction.
All right, Professor John. We've got a critic from the U.S. Talking about President Obama. But anyway, let me come back to you. One of the things that Professor Kuznick said is describing the situation then for the U.S. to use the atomic bomb to Japan's Hiroshima is, here I quote, military necessary, yet ethically not justifiable, morally not justifiable. But so the question is how to see history and how to see the decision-making process or the decision being made at a critical juncture of history.
Well, obviously the United States is the only country that's ever used the nuclear weapon as a weapon for many other countries, in spite of all the talk of how horrible other nations have been or may be in the future. Thus far, we have only one case. That's the United States using the weapon on Japan, on Hiroshima. I would say that the visit is an action, and the words are left for both the Japanese polity, the Japanese society, and the American society, American polity, to take whatever is comfortable with. It's a different way of trying to demonstrate closure about history between Japan and the United States. But what worries me, frankly speaking, is that many in Japan may turn this around and say, look, if the United States and Japan can have a closure of history without an apology, without differentiating the victimizer and the victim, what's the point? Why you folks in China, in Korea,
or in South Korea,
or in
North Korea,
or even elsewhere in Asia cannot do the same? I would think that would be the ramifications throughout the region.
Professor Kuznick, have you ever thought about that possibility?
Yes, of course. But I think it's important. History is very important. And the United States, at the core of America's idea of American exceptionalism, is the notion that World War II is a good war, which I think it was for the United States, but also that the atomic bombs ended the war, which is not true, and that the atomic bombs were justifiable. If Americans grappled with the notion that we dropped the atomic bombs in large part to send a warning to the Soviet Union, they were dropped on Japan, and Japan was victimized by them, but the real point of it was sending a message to the Soviet Union that the United States would do almost anything in order to make sure that the Soviets didn't interfere with post-war, with America's post-war hegemonic plans in Asia and in Europe.
We got your point. Let Professor Jia to respond briefly also.
Let's hope the United States would really learn a lesson from its own history of such cold-blooded calculation of saying, I'm going to drop a bomb on one country to send a message to another country, no matter where that is. And that's very, should I say, skillful explanation in the time of today's. I'm not suggesting that the professor sitting in Washington, D.C. is engaging anything, suspicious, but it's just scary to say that's one lesson from history.
All right, let me come back to you, Professor. I will go to our Japanese panelists a little bit later, but let me come back to you because it's important to ask that the logic you have just described, which is about the Second World War, at least from your academic perspective, is sending a message to the third country. And can we also use that logic, if that is the logic today, that the US President Barack Obama's visit to Japan and seem to mend the fences with Japan is trying to send any message, at least on the sideline, to any other third country or fourth country? And is that still a smart policy to be used and a smart strategy to be used? As you said, it's already tested during World War II. It's not the best one. In fact, it was quite a bad one. Professor Kuznick.
Who is that question to?
Yes.
Oh.
Sorry.
Yes, it's a dangerous and regrettable policy, but we mentioned before that the United States has used nuclear weapons twice. Well, that's true, but the United States has actually used nuclear weapons repeatedly in the same sense that a robber holding a gun to someone's head uses that gun without pulling the trigger.
Well, Professor,
it's been an essential element of American diplomatic history throughout that period.
What I'm saying is not necessarily just the nuclear weapon itself, but rather the logic behind the policy making of using the very first nuclear bomb to Hiroshima, and whether that logic aiming at a third party when making the policies is still in the minds of Washington. But you probably have time to think about that question. Let me go to our Japanese panelists just to be fair. Professor Jimbo, this is a fair question, I guess, coming from Mr. Jia, also here in Beijing, that will those so-called right-wing forces inside Japan interpret it differently from what you just said, from an academic, that they would think about this as a support coming from the US for Japan in the region and a mend of fences between the two countries, which would embolden Japan to go on whatever political path it aspires to be?
Well, I guess that it is always a good sign that we commit to the stronger U.S.-Japan alliance that has to be based on the U.S. commitment to defend Japan. And then, comes to the Obama's, compassionate stance towards supporting the Japanese main idea of the non-nuclear world. That is a good signal for the Japanese-U.S. alliance as a basis of the, trust between two sides. But I'd like to raise another argument. Japan has its another identity, which is the recipient of the U.S. nuclear umbrella or the extended deterrence. So in that case, what we really demand from the strategic perspective is that Obama also, issue the statement that as long as the nuclear weapons remain as a threat to Japan, for example, from North Korea, U.S. will provide effective and credible nuclear umbrella towards Japan.
Very interesting. A lot of twists and turns over there. Professor Jia, your response here to the 2 points.
No, I would think, a nuclear-free world has been said for decades and decades and decades. In action, countries march in the opposite direction. That's a reality, but then the decision-making behind the actual use of it is more critical. As to the point of a U.S.-Japan alliance, it's a fact of life. It has a long history to itself. It's just we hope and we need to stand guard against this alliance being used for an imaginary threat and also which may lead to leaving damage on humanity wherever it is going to be.
Very interesting points raised by all of you gentlemen, but let me take you to some of the statistics indicating to us one of the important possibilities you have been talking about, that is the use of the weapons of mass destruction. After World War II, the amount of power of mass destruction weapons have only been increasing. Take a look at this. The Federation of American Scientists estimates there are now more than 17,000 nuclear warheads, and nearly a quarter of those are classed as operational. The little boy used in the Hiroshima, the so-called little boy, was only 15 kilotons, but many other atomic bombs being delivered by US and Russia, then the USSR, are much more destructive than that. So here we come back to the eventual question, Mr. Kuznick. Can we use nuclear weapons as a legitimate way to defend ourselves, even though it could have the possibility of destructing others?
No, that's why the positive message that Obama brings is that we need to abolish nuclear weapons. And Obama's been committed to that since his student days in the early 1980s. However, his actions are going the opposite direction. He's calling for $1 trillion modernization program of America's nuclear arsenal over the next 3 decades. So that's the wrong message to send, I believe.
Okay.
But we have cut back. You mentioned the 17,000 figure. It's actually a little bit under 16,000 now.
Okay.
But that's so enormous because even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan has been estimated, in which 100 nuclear weapons would be used. Even that limited nuclear war could lead to the deaths of 2 billion people and a partial nuclear winter.
I got your point. Professor Kuznick. I need to leave 10 seconds for the other 2 panelists to also respond to this question. Professor Jimbo from Japan, use nuclear weapons to defend oneself against the possible use of others of nuclear weapons? Is that logical?
Well, obviously that, President Obama tried to de-emphasize the role of the nuclear weapon in the U.S. security strategy. But at the same time, as long as the nuclear weapon remains as a basic kind of a threat to other country, I think we really need to maintain the effectiveness of the nuclear strategy.
Okay. Professor Jia here in Beijing, 10 seconds for you. Sorry for a very short answer.
Let's work towards improving nuclear safety and also disaster management in civilian use. I think that's more of a real fruit that humanity needs. Nuclear weapons has been a way of life and will be a way of life.